Thank you. Thanks for having me. A lot of you are repeat customers since we've been in other sessions today, so I'll try to figure out new stuff to talk about in the address tonight. First, I want to thank the journalism department for putting this on. Sarah, the crew is an amazing experience. I was talking with Blois earlier. This place is so much nicer than when I went here. You guys have new computers and fancy rooms. We did not. And it's also fun to see so many of the professors and so many people who were instrumental in my life who showed up here, and I appreciate that. And then all of you who have better things to do with your time, but you're going to sit and listen to me for 45 minutes. So I appreciate that. My parents are here. One of the things I'm going to talk about sort of throughout the speech is how much little nudges from people kind of get to you to where you are in life. They had faith in me when I can guarantee you that faith was not warranted. I am inspiration to all the late bloomers in the room, which we'll get into. So thank you guys for being here. So I want to talk a little bit and just tell some stories. Sometimes I feel like the Forrest Gump of Oshkosh. I somehow kept like bouncing into the middle of all these things in political history that I got a front row seat to. So I'll tell some fun stories about that. But one of the themes on each part of them, and this I do think applies especially to the students, but to all of us, there's like nothing that I've done where it's not somebody who sort of nudged me or pushed me or like did something that they didn't have to do. And to me, like I try to live that in my own life, trying to help and be generous with people. Don't underestimate how much you can do, and for the students, how much other people can do for you. I mean, when I was thinking back about the speech, and so if you go back to Jim of 1991, I was not a great high school student, sorry, and I couldn't even get into the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. I had to go to the University of Wisconsin extension at Menasha to be able to get in to here. And so 1991, I was still a little bit of a mess. I had just gotten off having a 1.391 grade point average. And my first brush with media was not one that made my mom super happy. I finally made the front page of the Oshkosh Northwestern. However, it was because I was protesting the drinking age, and I was the only buffoon you could see on this on the Capitol steps. Somewhere in there, I started to figure I should probably get my stuff together and figure out what I'm going to do with my life. Bounced around from a couple of majors, and this is where the university was really huge for me. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to be, I knew I was a good writer, and at the time I thought I knew a lot about sports. I was like, I'll be a sports writer. And so I met Gene Hintz, who's no longer with us, but he was the chair of the journalism department. And for whatever reason, he took like an instant interest in me and encouraged me and helped me get a job at the Oshkosh Northwestern before I ever took a course in journalism. Once I got that job, he said, just keep doing internships, like doing whatever you're doing, and I'll just keep figuring out ways to get you A's so you can focus on your work. So I finally figured out how to get an A in a class. That was cool. And that really changed my life. Like the minute I started doing journalism, like journalism, like this is definitely what I want to do and what I have to do with my life. I figured out pretty early on that like I don't think I want to do sports journalism forever. So two things happened in 1992 that really, I think, profoundly changed my life. And again, it goes to this university. One was there was an internship that they made available through the political science department to send somebody out to Washington to work for. At the time, you could do Petri or Herb Cole. Dr. Simmons, who's here from the political science department, was one of the folks who was on the panel, and I'm virtually certain I had the lowest grade point average of anybody who applied for that internship, and yet somehow I got that internship. And had I not gotten that internship, I wouldn't be here. Like, there's no way. Like, we had traveled a little bit. We spent a lot of time going up north when we were kids, but I'd hardly been out of Wisconsin but a couple of times in my life. Certainly had never been to D.C. The internship put me out in D.C., and I became obsessed with politics, obsessed with D.C., obsessed with finding my way back there. But if I don't get that internship, none of this happens. Right that same year, as I was trying to think about what do I want to do if I don't do sports, I want to do news. I want to do maybe politics. And so I picked up a phone book. This is a good lesson for the students in here. And I just called every single newspaper in the state of Wisconsin. I said, I'll do anything. I'll do it for free. Is there anything I can do? And I called the Brilliant News, which is somewhere between here in Green Bay, a weekly newspaper, and a guy, Zane Zander. The Zanders had owned this paper going back into the 1800s. And he said, "Can you come up and talk to me today?" Hell yes. So I go up and I explain to him at this point, I still maybe had taken one journalism class at most. And I explained it to this, and he said, "I don't care." He goes, "Will you run my paper?" I'm like, again, like I've not really taken a journalism course. I'm not a businessman yet, but like, I don't know if that's good business for you. He's like, "Doesn't matter." He goes, "My editor just told me if I don't let him take 3 months off to go to Finland, he's going to Finland for good." He goes, "So in the next week, I'm going to teach you how to run a newspaper." I'm like, wow. And he's like, "It gets better." He's like, "I'll give you $300 a week, the use of a car for the summer, and I'll give you my cottage, which was on a little lake, with a refrigerator filled of beer." I was like, that's a hell of a perk when you're from Wisconsin and you're my age. So I did it. And I learned more in those 3 months than I could have learned in years. But here's, like, again, luck of timing. Had I not happened to call this person at this time, that never happened. So that the combination of that internship, of Dr. Hintz helping me out, and of going to Brilliant, that together gave me the confidence to go out to DC, which I did in '95. It's interesting, like, because by the time I go out to DC, a lot of you are too young to realize this, like, politics and media used to be normal. Like, you'd have political fights, and you'd have, like, newspapers that would do something that would maybe irritate people, but, like, things were just normal. Like, your political consumption might have been 10% of your time, and, like, people just lived their lives and had better things to do than to worry about what was happening in politics and what was happening in media. Well, I go out to DC. I don't think I'm to blame for this, by the way, because literally everything went to shit from the moment that I went out there to today. I don't think I'm the cause, but we'll get back to that in a second. So I go out there, and my dream is I always said, if I could move out to DC, if I could one day cover leadership at Roll Call, which is this small newspaper that covered Capitol Hill obsessively, then I will have achieved everything I want to achieve. So since then, I've been playing with house money. And so I got that job in '96. Well, again, this is where timing plays out. I get this job. I have this obsession with covering leadership, and I had had a little bit of experience covering Republican leadership. Well, lo and behold, Newt Gingrich is speaker, Bill Clinton's president, and Newt is like the biggest story in America. Congress is almost never a big story. For that time that I was there, it was one of the biggest stories in politics. And here I am covering it, 25, 26, and I'm good at it. I had tons of sources. I was breaking tons of stories. And it allowed me to start to break stories that other people actually cared about. And so and this is still pre-internet. We had just started to build a website. And I actually remember the first time that we ever used a website to distribute news in any meaningful way. And I was covering, there was this period where Bob Livingston was this congressman who'd been around forever, and he's about to become speaker. And there had been a raft of scandals, sex scandals. And I had found out that he had been having an affair with a lobbyist who had business before his committee, and that he was going to have to step down as the would-be speaker. And I had it before anyone else, but all we had was a newspaper. And so we tapped it up on rollcall.com and blasted it out and beat the world to the story. And that night, I remember going out to the Capitol, and there's this big parking lot. It used to be wide open before 9/11, and just going from CNN to Fox to ABC to NBC to CBS, because we had this amazing exclusive. And so it was like, wow, 26, 27. So right around that time, again covering the same group of people, I was the first person to figure out that Republicans had been meeting in the basement of the Capitol to plot the beginnings of Bill Clinton's impeachment. Now, this was a massive story, and I get a call, and it's the producers for Matt Lauer and Katie Couric. And they're like, "We want you on the Today Show." Well, I moved out there. I didn't have any money. All I had was like some sports coat that was way too big for me that my dad had given me. And so I'm like, I'll do it. And I look back at that film. One, I looked really young back then. I looked like I was like 16. I looked scared shitless. And I'm talking to Katie Couric and Matt Lauer. And it was just like, wow, this is crazy. Like, people cared about the stuff that you're covering. But having done that, I learned so much about how to be a good reporter in that period. And because I was doing something that people were paying attention to, just happened to be in the right place at the right time, I get a call from the Wall Street Journal. And at that time, the Wall Street Journal never hired people in their 20s. And they certainly never hired people in their 20s to cover Congress and then the White House. But I happened to be in that little sweet spot of covering something that not that many people knew a lot about, had a track record where I sort of delivered the goods. And this is the funny ironies of life. I only figured this out afterwards. To this day, I'm convinced I only got the job because the person that I was partnered with didn't want me to get the job. So the editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal at that time had this blood feud with this David Rogers, who's one of the more famous reporters on Capitol Hill. And David Rogers was dead set against hiring me, angry about it. And because Alan hated David so much, I'm still convinced that he wanted to screw him, so he hired me. The irony of it is, David ends up becoming probably the biggest mentor in my life in terms of teaching me to be a real journalist. He's a real curmudgeon, real character, but like the best journalist I've ever met, one of the best I've ever seen, a dear friend of mine to this day, and like changed my life as a journalist. So I'm at the Journal, I'm in, my late 20s, and like it's amazing ride through Washington. And politics is starting to get, a little bit weird at that point. It's starting to be, you've got cable TVs taking off. Remember, pre-cable TV, there wasn't really that much noise. All you had was the editorial pages. But now you had cable TV where if people had really strong views, they could find somebody to say you're right and someone to give you ammunition. So if you were a conservative and you're really a median and conservative, you could drink a beer and watch Sean Hannity, and he would remind you that you're just so superior. And if you're a liberal, you could turn on Rachel Maddow and drink your Chablis, and she'll tell you you're just so intellectually superior. So that was different, So things are starting to get more and more politicized. In come the Clintons, and sort of they really professionalize kind of warfare politics, just like Newt had in Congress. Now it's in the White House, and it's getting kind of ugly, right? And so I'm at the Wall Street Journal, and there you start to cover really big, important things, and I did it for a little while. Then I got to cover it, got moved quickly to the presidency, and that was. It was crazy to cover the presidency because you are literally have a front row seat. When he's on Air Force One, you're in rotation, you might be on Air Force One with him. You're sitting next to the president, you're interviewing the president. You just get this lens into the world that very few people get, and I was always deeply appreciative of having that. I remember on 9/11, I remember sitting vividly in the office. I had to make the front page of the Wall Street Journal was really hard back then, especially these things, these long investigative pieces that they would run. I had spent about a year, and I had the best piece I had written in my career. I basically had the U.S. Chamber of Commerce dead to rights that they were basically using. They're using the U.S. Chamber to basically funnel money through a bunch of different companies that were trying to influence either tort law or influence regulation. And it finally ran on 9/11 that morning. So as I'm sitting there, super proud of this great achievement, all of a sudden, even before the plane ever hit the building, or I saw the plane hit the building, but then before anyone knew other planes had hit, we're getting calls from reporters who were driving in saying a plane just crashed in to the Pentagon. And so to that day, and we were right down by the White House. I was at the White House the other day. I was telling somebody, I remember that day having to go from the Wall Street Journal to the White House to get briefed by Ari Fleischer, and it was a war zone. All it was military with their machine guns, and everyone had been sort of pulled out of the area because people assumed there was going to be another terrorist attack. And that was really, to me, beyond just the death and loss, which is obviously awful and big at scale. It really started to inject a level of fear into politics. People were just a lot more nervous than they ever had been before. I think people finally, probably the first time in my lifetime, probably since the scares of a nuclear war from when I was a little kid, people were really, really worried. They really had a sense of vulnerability. And I think that really started to change politics. Once people are scared, once people have an outlet, once you have this constant warfare over impeachment and people's sex lives, it just started to get toxic. But even now, in retrospect, it was normal compared to now. Back then, I'd pay to have the normality of back then compared to what we have today, because it was still pre-web. And so I kind of thought, like, almost, one of the patterns you're going to see is I can't keep a job. So I only did that for 3 years, and I thought I would do that for the rest of my life. And I got hired by the Washington Post. They gave me this, you can cover campaigns, you can cover whatever you want in Washington. It's like, wow, hallelujah. And so I went there and covered the presidency for a little while. And in both times, you get to know George Bush a little bit, and like, love him or hate him, like, he was kind of a fun guy to cover. Like, he is exactly what you think he is. Like, he has real personality. And unlike this administration, which leaks everything every hour of every day, covering the presidency, I used to be depressed sometimes. I didn't enjoy it as much as I should, because you didn't really get to learn anything that was real, because the president and his staff kept everything so tight, especially Bush and especially Obama. It was very hard to get like real glimpses. Where with Trump, I always joke, I'll learn more today about what's happening in real time that you would think they wouldn't want you to know than I would have learned in 2 years of covering Bush. This White House leaks like a sieve. They didn't at all back then. But you do start to get a relationship with them. And I had a couple funny Bush stories I'll tell you. One was he never came back to see the press. And so never, when he was on Air Force One. So when you're on Air Force One, you're in rotation. And so if you're the only print reporter, you're basically representing all other print reporters. And I'm on Air Force One. I'd been out the night before too late. And so I didn't have a suit on. I had like a wrinkled shirt, showed up late, and I'm on Air Force One. So I'm sitting there and I'm trying to sleep. Someone taps me on the shoulder. They're like, the president wants to see you. He has an announcement about, had something to do with the Iraq war at that time. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. So I walked there. There's a little cabin in the front of Air Force One where the president is, sort of their secure cabin where he has a little table. And I walk to the door, and Bush looks at me and he goes, VandeHei? He's like, what the hell are you wearing? And I'm like, I said, with all due respect, sir, you haven't talked to the press in a decade. I'm sorry you chose today to do it. Another funny Bush story. I was at the Post. I got a call from the First Lady's office that she's going to go to Egypt, Jordan, and Israel. Do you want to be the pool for that? And I said, yes, I've never been to those places. It'll be awesome. And so I go, and back then, this is when there was this big push by the Bush administration to spread democracy around the world. And so I go, and there's a press conference that the First Lady calls with Mrs. Mubarak, who was the wife of Hosni Mubarak, who ran Egypt at the time, who was clamping down on democracy in Egypt. And so she's standing on this big platform with her, and the pyramids are in the background. And I get the first question, and I said, okay, your husband's back home preaching democracy, and you're sitting next to the woman who's married to a guy who's cramping down on democracy here in Egypt. How does that work? She didn't like the answer. She didn't like the question. She was livid. Wanted to kick me off the trip. And so she ends up being just a sort of a disaster for the next couple of days that I'm there. I get back, and George Bush calls a press conference. And there's a very set form to how press conferences work. We'll call on AP. We'll call on Reuters. We'll call on NBC. We'll call on CBS. He calls a press conference. It's in the Rose Garden. First question, he goes, VandeHei, you were with my wife. Do you have a question? And it was so funny because it was so like, VandeHei, my wife came home and busted my chops. Thanks a lot. So it was very funny. He was a character to cover. One last Air Force One story. So again, like luck of the draw, like you never know when you're going to be pooled. And so we were in India, and I was pool, and there's like, you're pool, we can't tell you where you're going. And so we get to Air Force One, and we take off, and they shut off all the lights. And it turns out what they had done is they had shut down and evacuated Islamabad in Pakistan. And you have to fly in the dead of night with your lights off, and they actually use a decoy plane. So when Clinton did it the first time, they have a fake Air Force One land in the dead of night, the president come out in a fake president wave as a decoy to see if you're going to get assassinated. And so we land in Pakistan, in Islamabad, and it was surreal because there's a massive area, but there's nobody. And then it turns out that like Pakistan grows these men that are like 7 feet tall. They're huge. So all you have is like, you have this presidential palace, and the architect who did the presidential palace in Islamabad is the same architect who did the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. So you're sitting there with these huge Pakistani guys, and it's like you're sitting there in front of the Kennedy Center. It is unbelievable. And then he did a press conference with Musharraf, who was head of Pakistan at the time. So there definitely were cool dimensions to covering the White House. I always wish I enjoyed it more. It's hard because you're on the road. You don't get to, you're away from your family and stuff like that. So I probably got tired of it quicker than most would. So that's what I thought my life was going to be. I thought that's it. Like I'm gonna cover the presidency. I'm gonna write books. I'm a journalist. And I figured that's what I'm gonna do. And this takes you to about 2006. And again, like this, 2006 sounds like a long time ago. Like to me, it's a short time ago. Go back to 2006. There's still no Facebook. There's no iPhone. There's no Instagram. There's a baby Google. There's no Snapchat. There's no Breitbart. There's no Huffington Post. There's no Politico. There's no Axios. None of this stuff existed. None of the technology. None of these companies. But you could feel like something in the air. You could tell things were changing. You could start to see data that people were going online. You could see newspapers starting to struggle. And I had never, in retrospect, I had an entrepreneurial gene, but I never had thought of myself as an entrepreneur. And in the summer of 2006, Google bought YouTube. And YouTube at the time was still tiny. And I remember having a conversation with my colleague, who was my boss at the time, John Harris. I said, you know what? What if Eric Schmidt, who runs Google, came to us and said, I want to be better than the Washington Post. What would it cost me? And it's like, the truth is, I don't think it'll cost that much, because we know who the really good journalists are. No one's taking advantage of the web. And cable TV has this insatiable appetite for political coverage. So why don't we start a company that does that? Like take the New York Yankees approach to journalism, hire the 5 or 6 best people, put them in one company, and then we'll be off to the races. And from that conversation that evolved out of nowhere to us launching and going public was less than 6 months. Like we just did it. And I had a baby at home. I had a wife. We had a house. Like DC's expensive to live in. And like, it was astonishing. And that's why I think like so much of life is like destiny, or it's guided by God. But it's because we never thought about it. We never even flinched. And for me, like as you can tell, I moved around a lot. It wasn't that weird, but John Harris, who I started with, he'd been there 20 years. And it wasn't just like we were leaving the Washington Post. I mean, that would be, like you didn't do that. People thought we were literally on drugs. And as we're leaving, even they pulled out all the stops, and they had Bob Woodward call us. They had Ben Bradley call us. They had Don Graham call us. I mean, I was saying earlier today, that's like having Aaron Rodgers call and say, "Please don't leave as a Packer fan." You're like, "Okay, I won't leave." Like you don't do that, and like we still did it. And the nudge there was what really was from my wife. Like with no exaggeration, is a great story. And she deserves. She both named Politico, but she also. There's this famous scene, at least in my life, in my mind, of what we call the coffee walk, where I always thought that John Harris, my partner, would not do it. I thought he'd back out at the last second, and Autumn was certain of that too. And he wanted to do one last gut check and basically wanted to talk me out of it. And as I'm walking out the door, my wife looks at me and she's like, "You son of a bitch, he's not talking you out of starting this company." And I'm like, "Oh, I won't. I'm so tough." So of course he talks me out of starting the company. And I walk in and I have this facial expression of like guilt. And Autumn is like, no. And she picks up a piece of paper and she writes a note to Harris and to his wife and to me, quoting Teddy Roosevelt and Winston Churchill and seizing the moment and quit being a wimp, and it put us over the edge. So we started that. And you think about it, as we're starting Politico, Obama's on the scene, Clinton's on the scene, internet's starting to take off. So this is early 2007. What else happens in early 2007? Almost the exact same time, the iPhone comes out. So now you've got the iPhone, now you've got Facebook, now you've got Google. The world is really, really changing in big ways. And we rode that wave in a huge way. Like we were, from when we launched in January, I was on stage co-moderating a presidential debate, and 4 months later. Like this unheard of. And never should have happened. Like it's funny, like these romantic stories of, oh, you like Politico is such a great success, and it was actually a great success. I sucked at running Politico in those first couple of years, like terrible. I'd never run anything, and like so, like you have this company that everyone's, oh my gosh, it's changing journalism. CNN's doing stories on it. We're in the New York Times, but you're sitting there and you're running it. And you're like, man, I think I just screwed up my career, and we're going to smash into a mountain. I'm screwed. But it somehow took off, and in that period, I had to transition from being a reporter to being a CEO, to run a company. And for those first couple of years, like I really was, in retrospect, terrible at it. I was great because I had like great work ethic and I could kind of muscle through any problem, but I was a terrible manager. I was terrible at hiring. I didn't understand the value of talent. I didn't understand the value of a culture. And it took me years of getting so many things wrong to little by little start to get it right. And that switch was really fun because I was able to take the reporting skills that I would use to break a story to go figure out problems about how do you run it, how do you hire, how do you structure a company, how do you create a culture of excellence. And over that 10 years, became obsessed with all the things that I used to mock, culture and like talent and collaboration, like all these things that now like I spend most of my time preaching about internally. At the time, like I didn't know anything about it. But it was a wild ride because the world was changing. We were able to bring more voice, more energy, but more depth to political coverage. People were super interested. I think people probably became too interested in politics, but people became super interested in politics. And in that whole period, you went from now you had nowhere to express your opinion to now you've got Facebook, and soon you would have Twitter. And I think as a society, we've not come to grips with how much Facebook and Twitter changed our lives. I don't think our species was supposed to have this ability to communicate with anybody at any time. I think somewhere we went wrong. I just don't think we were because what happens? Like the people, like everyone's like, why isn't there moderates? Like there's no market for moderation. Have you ever been on Twitter? Have you ever looked at what's in your Facebook feed? It invites garbage. It invites argument. It invites polarization. So politics starts to really go off the rails. Becomes very toxic, and then starts to become even celebritized. Like people are always like, oh, like Trump came out of nowhere. Trump did not come out of nowhere. That seed was planted in 2006 and probably before it, and some version of him was inevitable. How do we know he was inevitable? Well, think about Sarah Palin. Like, God bless John McCain. I went to his funeral. I knew him well, did many very cool things. Like, I don't think he got enough criticism for putting Sarah Palin on the ticket. And that's not an ideological comment. It would be like anybody who ever worked for her or with her would say the exact same thing. She just wasn't qualified. She was a celebrity. She had a certain appeal to her. But then it sort of in some ways diminished, and especially for the Republican Party, which really had been a kind of a hierarchical party. The next person in line gets it, and it was kind of predictable. This really started to change politics. And so, funny Sarah Palin story. So in 2012, still at Politico, I was writing from time to time, and she was running again in 2012. And so I did a piece quoting all the Bush people and others and a lot of anonymous sources about how terrified the Republican Party was that she would run and that she would win and what it would do to the party. And so she didn't like that piece. So she went on Fox. She went on Fox News and she said, "Well, I'd like to use my anonymous sources to say that Jim's a piece of crap." And then she goes on Twitter, and this is the part I had to write down. She goes on Twitter and she says, "I'd like to use anonymous sources to elaborate on Jim. He's a homophobe, child molesting, tax evading, anti-dead-tight, puppy-kicking, chain-smoking porn producer." Yes, she wrote that, and yes, a few of you probably thought she should be president. So right around that time, people forget that right around 2012, Trump's thinking of running. So it wasn't Trump. Almost every election has always thought of running, but in 2012, is thinking about running. And this is right after the Palin thing, and we do TV from time to time. So I'm on Morning Joe, and I knew Trump a little bit. He's always active in politics. Occasionally they would call, and I knew him, and I knew Michael Cohen a little bit. And I was on the day that like a poll came out that showed that Donald Trump was leading in the polls if he would jump into the Republican primary. And I was on there, and I was like talking about, well, this is crazy. Like, how can he's a liberal? If you look at his positions, he's a liberal. He gives money to Hillary Clinton. He can't possibly run as a Republican and win in the Republican Party. And so I get off the set, and Maggie Haberman, who's now at the New York Times, who worked for me at Politico, she emails me. She says, "Hey, that Donald just called and wanted to pass along that you're a big piece of shit." So that was my first. We'll get to him in a second. We're gonna get back to him in a second. So, but like politics is starting to become very, very celebritized at this point, and I think after that, in some ways, it kind of went off the rails, and not because of the Republican Party, not because of Trump. It went off the rails because all of these things that I had happened to be able to sort of be there for all kind of hit at once. The ability to go get your ideas reinforced and get sort of your own intellectual ammunition on cable TV, your ability to express yourself at scale at any point. And no matter how dumb your opinion was, people would follow you, they'd fan you, they'd clap for you. The more they clap, the more they fan, the more you do. And so that was unleashed. And then a lot of us started moving away from people who don't share our political views. If you just look at the demographics of the country, Republicans basically head for the hills, and Democrats pack themselves like sardines inside of cities. And you end up with this sort of tribal politics that we have. And I'm sort of sitting there, and sort of obviously at Politico, you have like a huge lens into all of this. And so we did that, did Politico for, did it for 10 years. And learned a lot about how people consume information, really tried to become a student of how people consume information. Also started to have like the earliest thoughts about like politics, while interesting, like somewhere as a country we did go off the rails. Like we're consuming way too much politics. We're watching way too much cable. We're on our phone sucking up too much political noise. I don't think that's what was meant to be. I think there was a time where we didn't have enough political coverage. Now we probably had too much political coverage, and we certainly had it too much. It is too big of a part of our lives. And so we started thinking about like, what does the world need? Like, what does the world look like in the future? And really started to study the data. And it was interesting. Like, there's two takeaways that I had. One is, no matter what you say, you don't read. You at least don't read long. Very few people were reading stories beyond a couple of hundred words. The most humbling moment I had as a journalist is I was writing a column with Mike Allen, my colleague, and we had two columns back to back that were, I don't even remember what the topic was, but they were big deals. We had 1 million page views. That's a lot. 1 million people read it. I think one of them President Obama had to respond to. And this is back on a web page where you had to paginate it, so you had to click to go to the next page. I went back and I looked at the data. And 81% or 81 or 82% of people never made it past that first page. And that first page could fit about 400 words on it. And it was written in a way you kind of had to read all 4 pages. So 80% of people on a story that was of real import, nobody made it past the first page. And it was the beginning. You think, well, okay, I could say that sucks. Like, I hate humanity. Why won't they read all my brilliant words? Or you could say, well, wait a second, like maybe the consumer is right. Maybe like us as journalists, we're not fully serving the customer. Meaning that most stories, if I'm being honest, that I'd written over the years, they were too long. They didn't need to be as long as they were. Most stories tell you something new and you want to know why it matters, and then you want the power to go deeper. And we're like, well, what if we built a company built on that proposition? That we know that's how people want to consume it. We'll give them the power to go deeper when they want to. But if all they do is read 200-300 words, that they really start to get the gist of the topic, and they have a good context for why it matters. That's sort of the device part of it. The intellectual part of it, the substantive part, and I talked about this morning. The world that we live in is about to get exponentially more complicated at a speed we're not equipped to keep up with. that if you just once you unleash technology, there's no case in the history of humanity where you slow progress. It only speeds up. And what we saw happen with the internet and how it disrupted our industry, other industries, AI, robotics, deep machine learning, it's going to rock your world in ways nobody's equipped for, that nobody's thinking about. And I'm not talking 20, 30 years from now. I'm saying now and soon. And what that requires, the way you get ahead of that, is that, to me, if you're a serious consumer of news, and not everybody cares about news, not everyone has to, but for people that do, you need to know more than just politics or just sports. You need to at least have an appreciation for what's happening with technology. What's happening with robotics and artificial intelligence? What's happening with China that might affect my job or my country? And so that's why we started Axios, and that's how we engineered the company. We engineered it we hire people who have subject matter expertise to narrate and sort of help you navigate those complicated topics in a much more digestible way. And the reader response has been really cool to it. That one, the nudge for starting the company, wasn't one person, but it was sort of the culmination that I could stretch back all the way to the university here of picking up the habit of people having done nice things for me trying to do the same for other people. When I decided to leave Politico and start a company, there's 6 people that said, regardless of what you're doing, and they were at the top of their game, they could have worked at any newspaper in the world. Mike Allen, one of the most famous journalists, all said, I'm with you no matter what you're doing. Well, that's pretty amazing. And I don't think it's because I'm a super smart guy. I think it was because I tried to spend time giving to them, trying to help them. I was there in good times. I was there in bad times. I was there when they needed help or didn't need help. And so the nudge came from, wow, I've got this group of people who I enjoy, who I find really, really smart, and I could go start something with them, and they want to, and they totally have your back. And that, to me, we've had, for us in our little world, and actually has been an awesome success. But the coolest part is not that it's a really good business or that we have real power with the company. It's that you're doing it with people that you care about. People that share my passion for they would talk the exact same way I am, with a little less profanity, about the passion behind the ideas, and that's really cool. And so when we started the company, and we ended up having to move it up 2 days because we had an interview with then President-elect Trump, about 72 hours before he was sworn into office. So we had started Politico almost to the day where Obama's taking off. We're starting Axios just as Donald Trump is taking off. By the way, that hour interview then, he's no different today than he was in that interview. Every interaction with him is, well, you love him or hate him, it's surreal. We're never going to see anything else like this. It was mind-blowing. And from there, the company instantly did what you kind of wanted it to do. And that's where the little things you can start to see where they all pile up and matter. The way you start a really good company, the way you could be a really good employee, is that talent matters. People who work really hard matters. People who can actually put the cause of the company above their own selfish ambition. It matters. Those things matter profoundly. People who want to earn your trust. Every single employee at Axios, whether you're on the tech side, business side, or editorial side, you're forbidden from talking about your politics, picking sides on issues or people on any social platform. It's hard for people to do, but they believe in what we're trying to do. The world doesn't need more noise. We got plenty of that. We don't need more nonsense. We got an abundance of that. And so if we can do our little part to help earn back at least some trust from some readers, and then we can help them get smart about the topics that we care about, that's a cool business, it's a cool calling. I think it's a cool culmination of my journalistic career. And I'd say, and that's where I'll sort of end with this, is that the arc that started in the classrooms here really hasn't changed. my passion today, even though when people say, what do you do? I'd actually say I'm a journalist. Well, actually, I'm a CEO. You think I would say a CEO, but I don't think of myself that way. I think of myself as a journalist. I'm obsessed with content. I'm obsessed with how do you help people better understand the complexities of the world? How do you gain their trust? How do you give them the insight that you might have some access to? And then you ride the luck. Like where I'll do a plug for our new HBO show that's starting November 4th on HBO, 6:30 p.m. Eastern, 5:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. Running 4 consecutive Sundays. But another nudge. A guy who runs HBO, Richard Plepler, happened to be a fan as a reader and took interest in us even before we started the company. This woman, Perry Peltz, who's a friend of mine, happens to be a friend of his, is a documentary filmmaker. And the stars just happened to align that they believed in us and said, without really any negotiation, you're doing a show on HBO. So, okay, we'll do a show on HBO. But again, that happened because a couple of people who you probably had done good business with in the past and had shown yourself to be someone that they want to work with took a chance. And who knows, you might watch a show and say it's a total debacle, but it'll be fun, at least trying to put it together. But even that show still fits in that arc, which is, I really believe in journalism. For you, I know that it's a pretty good mix of folks here. Some are journalism, some have nothing to do with journalism, some are PR. But we all consume it. This stuff matters. It really, really matters. People laugh about fake news. I hate fake news. I hate the term. I think it's stupid. I think it's wrong. I think it really eats at the fabric of our country. You got to remember, as imperfect as we are by far and away the most perfect experiment in governance in the history of humanity. There's something about democracy, there's something about capitalism that works. I think a key ingredient to that is a free press. It is media, it is information, it is the ability to hold public officials accountable, to expose corruption, to bring the Me Too movement out of behind closed doors and into the public, and for that pain that people had to go through, for there to be some comeuppance for people who injected pain and did bad things. This stuff really, really, really matters. And when you start to trivialize it, or you start to treat it like a game, or you start to just want your own tribal, I feel really good because someone else agrees with me, it's just dangerous. And that doesn't mean you got to love us. It doesn't mean you have to love reporters. It doesn't mean that we're not flawed as journalists. All of that stuff is true. But if you ask me of all the things that scare me right now, having thought a lot about these topics, and I can often have pretty dark views about the next 5 to 10 years, the thing that scares me most is that we've just become so untethered from the truth that we can't get back. That we basically habituated ourselves to wanting to live in our bubbles and to feel very comfortable in our bubbles. It doesn't work. It doesn't work long term. That's the thing. It works now. I mentioned this earlier. For all of the whining about the last couple years, there's probably, arguably, the best 2 years in the history of humanity by almost every indicator. If you look at economic prosperity across the globe, if you look at the reduction in the number of people who are living in poverty, if you look at the dearth of active wars, if you look at the number of people killed in hostile conflicts, by almost every measure of humanity, this is nirvana. But it won't last. Something bad will happen. There will be a cyber attack. There will be a terrorist attack. There will be some kind of thing that we'll all be talking about 20 years from now, but that's unknowable at this moment. And then truth really matters. It really matters. It matters when it's hard. It matters when you have to figure out what happened, how do we react, what do I trust? If we get into this pattern where we trust nothing, you're going to end up making really, really bad decisions. And that's why, if you've committed yourself to this, if you're a reader of it, I'd urge you to take some ownership. Someone asked it in one of the earlier sessions, how do you fix this? How do you fix this problem where people don't trust anything? And there's definitely things we could do in the media. I've said it before, shut off Twitter, shut down Twitter. It's the worst damn thing that ever happened to reporters. It exposed their biases in ways that make me ashamed many days. That's definitely a piece of it. But the piece that we don't talk enough about when we are assigning blame is you. You're to blame too. I'm to blame. You choose what you read. You choose what's in your news feed. All Facebook's doing is pumping more of what you want into your feed. So if you're getting a lot of garbage, guess what? You sought the garbage in the first place. And you clearly are craving more of it because that's all Facebook is. It's an algorithm that gives you more, 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 more. 60% of people share stories without ever reading them. Read the damn thing. If someone says, I read that on Facebook, Facebook is not a news organization. There are no reporters working at Facebook. Facebook is a vessel through which other news organizations give you content. But check where it is. There's a difference between something that came from Axios or the New York Times and something that came from some stupid website that you've never heard of before. You own that. You do. You own that. You have to make the decision that I'm going to stop reading crap. I'm going to stop sharing crap. I'm going to stop just assuming that because someone else doesn't agree with me that I therefore don't want anything to do with it. I just belittle them. Like that self-ownership, I think, is going to be a big piece of this, because this is not an easy thing to fix. Like I'm convinced that the world changed in really, really profound ways in that 06, 07 period. Once we got on to the big platforms, once we unleashed this ability to communicate in real time, think about your own life. How many times are you looking at your phone? Average person looks at your phone every 4.3 seconds. You probably do it more than that. I do. Like, it's just changed. Like, and our minds aren't equipped for this. So we have to figure out, what are the rules of the road? Should we regulate Facebook? Should we self-regulate how we use these social platforms? Should reporters sort of require themselves institutionally not to use Twitter? Like, I think there are all these little pieces that are going to have to work together. And I would say to Trump, I would say to any president, like, stop with the fake news stuff. We don't need less suspicion. We don't need more suspicion. We don't need less trust. We need more trust. And a lot of that can only be done by big organizations, by government, like by what we say and what we do. And my hope is that over time we figure these things out, and then journalism continues to thrive, and we continue to thrive as a great country. Because this is really, really the last thing I'll say. For all the people who are, like, I think we all feel more anxious than we've ever felt before. I will say this, like, and I often feel it myself, but you're living in the best damn country in the history of the world. Like, the fact that I could be a dope in high school, could still be a dope in college, and could then somehow go out to DC and be able to interview presidents. Like, I'm not anything special. Like, good people did good things for me at different times, and I ended up in a really cool place. This country is still wired for that. That is the beauty of democracy and capitalism. You can thrive. It is a meritocracy. And people should be enjoying the opportunities. They should be taking advantage of technology. You should be taking advantage of information nirvana. Because if you don't, there's a country called China with 4 or 5 times as many people as we do that wants to eat our lunch. And so we have to make sure that we get it together and that we take advantage of all these awesome things about our system and get it right, instead of sort of wasting away our time on Facebook or Twitter. So thank you very much for caring about journalism. Thank you for coming.